Good morning, Overload Nation. So I'm seeing an article on Gamesindustry.biz and NeoGaf talking about a Robert at Zeboid Games saying that indie games should be cheaper. This is an interesting question, interesting dilemma, because ultimately it's fair market value about whether or not someone, in this case a consumer or a gamer, is willing to pay an X amount for a game. And Robert is arguing that games ought to be cheaper because they're easier to make, distribution is zero, and there's all sorts of other reasons why. I think ultimately it's down to fair market value. If the game developer spends, say, 10 hours a day working on the game, then he wants to be compensated 10 hours equivalent of, in this case monetary equivalent, 10 hours of work over the course, multiple days worth of 10 hours per each transaction. So that could be anything between £5 to £10 beyond. And at the same time, raising that price, it also prices out some other customers and consumers that that the game is not aimed for, not targeted at, like for example the income bracket or socio-economic background of the consumer. I don't think these are considered so much in the games industry. They're more like just potentially get cheap games out there that people enjoy. But I think it's also worth considering that as long as the game developer is happy with the price that the game is, and the consumer is ultimately happy with the price, and these are both reflected in how many sales the game has made. Because the developer is happy to release that game in said state, that he thinks it's profitable and worth a set amount, and the consumers are happy to buy that game knowing what they know via reviews or feedback or word of mouth about the game, the quality for example, or how fun it is, are willing to pay a set amount for it, whether that's 10, 15 or 20 pounds or such. If a lot of people are playing a game, people are a lot willing to pay a lot more to it. But it's also worthwhile considering that the free marketplace of ideas, that if a game is too expensive, people generally won't buy it. But it's also worth remembering that everyone always wants something cheaper. If something is £15, someone will always want it at 14, and if it's at 14, someone will always want it at 13. 13 quid is infinitely cheaper than 14 quid, and 15 quid is infinitely more expensive than 14 quid. So yeah, people will buy it on sale purely because it's a lot cheaper than before. But if consumers want a product, they will get it now. They will simply get it now because they want it. This is evident with the iPhone 6 that came out last year. When it first came out, people were selling it in China, where it is not allowed and banned, almost 50% more than the cost to buy it in the US. So if people want the games, if people want the product, if the consumer wants the product, the goods, they will buy it regardless of what the price is and if they want it. So if they're happy to pay a high price for something they really want, people will buy it. That's the point. You can make a game cheaper, say $1 or such. There's that perceived lack of value. You get what you pay for kind of mentality. But if the game exceeds your expectation with something generally quite cheap, then the consumer would say, yeah, I got a lot of value for this, but I really think that the designer or the dev really could have priced it more because it's justifiable. Then it's rather justifiable. So there's also this marketplace of ideas where if a game is not of good quality and overpriced, then this will show up in the reviews. People won't buy it, and this will show up in the sales ultimately, because people will vote with their dollars. They'll vote with their wallets. So there's a marketplace of ideas. If something isn't good enough to justify the price, people in the long term will not buy it. So what it's ultimately down to is whether or not the consumer is happy to pay the price for the game that the developer is happy to release. These two things are the great equilibrium in this case, I think. The consumer is happy and the developer is happy, because if the consumer isn't happy, they ultimately will not buy the product. They will not ultimately buy the game, and that's what the developer is. The developer is there to entertain and add value through their game. So what he does is he has to make the consumer happy, and by making them happy, they enrich him. That's what it's all about, finding fair market value. Stay tuned, Overload Nation, more to come.